Oh God, today as we gather in your name, and there's so many things that come with gathering in your name on this particular day for this particular group. Obviously, we want to learn and learn together, and so what we're after is a reflective style of learning to where it's not just head knowledge, but it becomes heart knowledge. At the same time, where there's something about being together in a community where we are known and at the same time we know. And there's levels of fulfillment that come with that. And then we also gather and we share the burdens that we know about in our community. At the same time, we share the burdens that are a part of our lives and in our families and in our friends and social networks. And all these things, what we hope and pray, Lord, is that what we count on is that you're in the middle of it all. The idea of even the thought of doing this alone, we don't even want to begin to, one, to even imagine that, but then two, for that to even be any level of a reality for our life and for us as this group, and then ultimately for our community. We're mindful of those needs that are around us, some in this room, some next door, some around the world. But we want to be faithful to be intercessors, to stand in those gaps, and at the same time to be your witnesses in the world. So use this time, as we always pray this at the beginning of this study, use this time as a means to an end. Something that you leverage with the work of your Holy Spirit so that there's something inside of us, inside of our nature, inside of our lives that even if it is to the smallest degree, moves closer to your Son, Jesus Christ. And so we ask for that, we plead for that, and we count on that, and we pray this in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, so chapter 16, the goodness of God. Keep in mind, we've for the last couple of weeks, we wanted to classify some of the different attributes. Large scale, we got two major themes: transcendence and immanence. The idea of God being completely separate than, completely foreign, outside of creation. That's transcendence. You have the idea of immanence, which is God being a part of. And the transcendence is God is unknowable because He's separate. The immanence is God is knowable because He's a part of. And the Bible holds both of these in contention with each other. At the same time, the church's history, classic theology, holds these as the two major means by which we perceive what has been revealed to us. All right, revelation. It is impossible for anybody to know God unless God reveals. And so then we perceive what God has revealed with an asterisk, knowing that there will be parts of that where our understanding is limited. But the great thing about God is God continually works in ways of revealing Himself so that His creation knows. Two major themes: transcendent, immanent. At the same time, if we were to say fly a little bit closer, sorry. If we were to move a little closer, see what you started, Kay? It's like sympathy coughing. So all right. Maybe I started it and she, gosh, sorry. If we move a little closer towards the ground, you would look at some of the attributes that could be maybe categorized in different avenues, like omnipotence, the idea of what God knows, the idea of what's power for God or things that are associated with power, and then the idea of God in space, where is God in all places. And then finally you get to attributes that we are more comfortable with, that would be attributes like holiness, goodness, justice, mercy, those concepts that we're familiar with, words that we've heard, that definitely show up in the Bible specifically, and part of our experience. I mean, most of us, when you think about your relationship with God, you probably don't use words like transcendence or immanence, but I mean they're a part of that. You would probably use other words like mercy and goodness and forgiveness and righteousness and holiness and things like that. So we're just started at a very broad level and have just sort of worked our way down to something that is more first person, something that we have a greater comfort level with, greater experience with when it comes to what has been revealed toward us. Goodness is one of those. So today, what I want us to do is we want to talk about goodness. And Tozer, it's a very brief chapter, on chapter 16, on goodness. And so what I want to do is I want to highlight some of the aspects of the chapter that help us in talking about goodness. And then I want to look at a couple of different scriptures to maybe how we've understood this in our life and even going forward. So what do we mean? If you had to define divine goodness, how would you define it? All right, so that at least when whatever it is, it's unending, right? Right, it's unending, it's infinite, it's eternal, it's consistent. Would that be fair? All right. So we know whatever it is, we know that we at least have some level of category with how it plays out in the life of a person and humanity in the world. But what would you, to go a little bit deeper, what would we say then? I mean, what do we mean by God being good? All right, so God is gracious. What's that? Merciful, right? Absolutely. Fair.
Whatever He does is to our benefit.
All right, so whatever God does, it is for the purpose of the benefit of humanity. All right, any others? Did I hear something else? So, all right, well, Tozer would agree with you. I mean, Tozer would describe divine goodness as part of His nature, that is God's nature, that disposes God to be kind, to be benevolent, and to be full of goodwill towards people. All right, so that's he sort of gives a little commentary on that. Tozer would say, and again, Tozer is a classic Christian person. So when he writes it, in a thumbnail sketch, he does a good job at just summarizing classic Christian theology. And so we could look at it from Wesley's perspective. We could look at it from the Reformers. We could go back to the early church mothers and fathers, and they would all be in this neighborhood. This idea of the part of God, that attribute, that part of God's nature, that disposes God to be kind, to be benevolent, to be goodwill towards people. Some might even say to be tender-hearted. I think some people said mercy, quick to sympathy, for understanding. The part of His nature that inclines God to bestow blessings. All those would be in line with what do we mean when it comes to defining divine goodness. Sure. Yeah, all that we associate with levels of, and I want to say, how do you define goodness? And use the word goodness, right? That's always a good way to define it. Oh, it means good, right? But love, kindness, mercy, all that is, we associate that, and we have perceived that to be God being some level of benevolent toward us. That now we could use the opposite. We could say that that God is not. God is not the opposite of that. So not hateful, not spiteful, not cynical, not that when it comes to the part of God's nature, when we talk about God's goodness, it is that God gives of His nature that is benevolent towards people. And I think you're right. I think all the words that we've mentioned are spot on if we were to even to go another leg down and to try to put some very tangible, fleshy terms to what does it mean to be benevolent. That is, God gives that to His creation, and that yields some level of happiness or some level of joy. Maybe to use the Matthew language, it yields from the Beatitudes some level of a state of blessing, and that God, there's a desire in God to want to impart that to creation, to His creatures. You know, all the goodness. This is what Tozer says, I think is really good, that God wants to impart to creatures or creation people all the goodness they are capable of receiving. And I think that's a good that's a good qualifier for it talks about the desire, the nature of God, to whatever level that a part of creation can perceive benevolence. That is what God gives, and I think Psalm 23 is a great example of this. Right, so I want us to look just briefly at probably the most known part of the Old Testament, and maybe in the Bible, Psalm 23. And I mean, so just think about the images. Now, you have to get into an Old Testament mind. All right, so think about being in wilderness, in sort of a dry, arid, quasi-desert area, and your job as a shepherd, obviously, which means you're meandering around the countryside. What is not a guarantee is water. What is not a guarantee is food. What is not a guarantee is protection. So all these things that we just sort of associate with basic aspects of life, in this day, those they weren't guarantees. Now they existed, but a lot of times you had to create them yourself and what have you. But yet this is how, and we associate this with David, King David, writing this late in his life, where he's looking back and he's reflecting. So look at the image. Kind of just remind yourself of the images that show up inside of this particular poem or reflection. Journal writing would be a good example. And notice this idea of benevolence that is given. Notice this idea of all these things that we said, like kindness and love and mercy and all this of His nature that God bestows upon creation. The idea of the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down. So notice green pastures, which if you've been out in the Judean wilderness, there are no green pastures. They don't exist. They might exist for a small portion of time whenever it rains, but they're here today, gone tomorrow. So you got the idea of green pastures. You've got the idea of still waters. You got this idea of restoration. You got this idea of leading me in right paths. And then even this, all right, so Pat, to your point about how whatever goodness is, it's perpetuated. It's long-lasting. It's eternal. It's not limited. So even the whole concept of what would be the biggest hurdle for all of us, where we look at it in the Old Testament, in the ancient world, or even today, death still is that obstacle. So even that, when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, one, He sustains me. His goodness is there. He comforts me. This idea of preparing a table. So God is the one doing the work. The one who's active in the psalm is not the person. The person's just the receiver. There's not anything this person does other than just receive goodness from God. And he takes from His life what those images would be. Now, if we were writing, it might look a little different. I mean, we would probably incorporate 2019 language and 2019 concepts and what have you. We wouldn't probably use still waters and green pastures and stuff like that. But if you will, just take a moment and sort of dive into what you know about the Old Testament and the ancient world. This is a person who is recalling and recounting all the goodness that he has received in the best way that he can perceive it. Green pastures, still waters. Even when I walk through something where it's fearful and is covered and cloaked in death, even in the midst of conflict with enemies, yet goodness comes. And then, of course, the summary statement, which is in the green. This is the last part where it's an inclusio type statement. It's sort of recounting with different language everything that is said. Goodness and mercy follow me. So again, this person, he's the actor or the one that is applying the verbs is God. The writer is the receiver. And so, I think Psalm 23 is a perfect example of what this good-natured God imparts to creation. You see images of life, and you see images of a sustained world that the writer just is the benefactor, just receives, and it's perpetuated, which means it's long lasting. It's got some. It can run for a while, and it doesn't end even after life. Now, what would be a great homework assignment is for us to go home and write our version of Psalm 23. And it would be, maybe the homework assignment would be is to go home and write, however long you want it to be, does not matter, okay? Whatever language you want to use, does not matter. But how would you describe what you have received from God in God's goodness? We might use family, we might use health, we might use a lot of things. I don't know. Each person's going to look a little different.
Don't you think it's still? I was reading and I was adding a few things like in 2019 that we would use the word, but yet when I read it, it still affects us.
Sure. Well, there are concepts and images. Because all right, so one of the things that you might associate with green pastures and still waters, could be provisions and peace. All right, and peace isn't necessarily the absence of conflict, although it sort of doubles down when it is. But the idea of calm soul, tranquil heart, whole relationships that are not in conflict or not with struggle. But yes, I think that obviously from our Christian perspective, and this is sort of like a hallmark, for us. This is not the first time you've heard Psalm 23, and so just inside of our memories. We read this at funerals. We read this in personal devotions. We might read this when it's times of ease or times that are not. So we have all these associations with Psalm 23 because it's just part of our life, right? I'm assuming that I don't think y'all are any different than me, but.
I want to say something that you won't take me but a minute. But when my son passed away, for some reason, this was so forward in my mind. Mm-hmm. I repeated it every night.
Sure.
Of course, I don't know if it was from the King James version. It
Mm-hmm.
was up on me. It said, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death,
right.
the darkest valley, it just would bring me so much peace. I wouldn't be able to go to sleep.
Right.
I must have done that for a long
Yeah, so which that's a perfect example of what we've all been talking about, is that whether it be this actual, the wording itself and what we've, again, what did Tozer say? God's desire is to impart to His creatures all the goodness they are capable of receiving. So when we read this, it sort of dials in and it touches that part of what we've received from God. And so the idea of peace, the idea of comfort, listen, the idea of assurance. I mean, one of the reasons why death is such a struggle for us when we lose a loved one, because what we want to know so desperately is just that they're okay. I mean, because there is a splitting for a while, right? From one side, one reality to the other. And so for those of us who are still on this side of the veil, who, have limited to even no vision looking forward into what's beyond, I mean, the longings of the heart is, because I can't watch over, particularly if I'm a parent or family member or whatever, I got to know they're okay. I mean, that's a level, once there is that assurance, there's all types of peace of mind. I mean, and what you've commented on is a perfect example, when losing a child, losing a loved one, and the idea of just resting in the evening that says, either whether it be quoting this or allowing the Holy Spirit to use that when you're reflecting or quoting it as a means to minister, to just give assurance. I mean, because what we want to know is that they're okay, and which takes a level of faith, all right, because you have to trust those persons to God. And so what you want to receive is, God, I need to know you got them. I need to know they're okay. And, I need to know your goodness. Now, thank you for leading us into the last part of what we wanted to talk about, which was near the end. But one of the questions that shows up in Tozer's book, in the chapter, is it's the very last page, I think. He asked the question, if I come to God, now it's a different context than what we're talking about, but it's similar. If I come to God, how will God receive me? Will I still receive goodness? All right, now the context in Tozer's book, in that part of the chapter, is not the same as what we're talking about here. But the same question exists, whether it be for us or whether it be for our loved ones. And Psalm 23, there are other scriptures that can become very helpful and become very useful by God to relay to us levels of assurance that either us as a people, we as a people, or people that are part of our life, loved ones, friends, whatever it may be, is that because I cannot hold and control, not to be negative, but I can't touch and watch over, I need to know that someone can. And what we hope and what we're asking is your goodness that I know that you've given to me also extends to other people. Now, whether we voice that or not, that is a thought that's running around inside of our brains and the longings of our heart. Excuse me. But Psalm 23, I think, is an excellent example. I mean, it touches on all the levels of goodness that, if we were to put in large terms, that we receive and perceive that God has given us. Life, some level of sustained life, some level of something being perpetuated, everlasting, long, and God is the giver, we are the receiver. In the psalm, the psalmist is not the one generating any of the goodness. The psalmist is acknowledging that this good-natured God has bestowed certain things to the person, and they're a receiver of it. And what they have received is goodness. Now, Tozer goes on to talk about the effects of the goodness and how that affects our life. And obviously the Bible is, probably the chief outside of our own personal experience where what we read and understand becomes first person, at least for a common entity that is helpful. The Bible would be the best one. Is that what we perceive from what the Bible teaches, and again, then what we experience, is that there is this God who does bestow these gifts, that to allow that God could be other than good is to deny the validity of all that we have received, and then to negate this moral judgment that we also perceive that God has. So just sit with it for a second. To say that differently, because I don't like the way I worded that. To say that differently, what undergirds moral judgment on behalf of God is His goodness. So who said mercy earlier? Or loving kindness or something? All right. So the back row is showing off. All right, I got it. Can't sit up front, but you'll show off from the back. That's all right. The reason why we associate even this, another attribute, which is judgment or justice with God, not as something to be feared, is because what undergirds justice and judgment is God's goodness. Does that make sense? You with me? And if God were not good, then there really is no distinction between kindness and cruelty. It just could be arbitrary. God could just be the bully with the magnifying glass on the anthill. So if we're part of the creation and God is the creator, dust off the latter part of the book of Job. I don't know if you've read Job recently. All right, so the beginning of Job we all know. All right, I want my day in court. I feel like I've been taken advantage of. We've all felt that, been there, and so there's this crying out of talk to me, give me an audience. Well, the second half of Job, he receives what he asked for. Right? How did it turn out? Now, we like the very last page where it's fully restored, right? We like the ending. That's like the Disney, oh, yeah, it's everybody wins, So, but, how does it actually... So, from the first part of Job to the middle until the very ending, there's this big, large... it's a number of chapters. It's not just a couple of verses. It's a number of chapters.
My favorite part of Job that I remind myself all the time is, who are you coming before me with
Right.
questions without wisdom?
Right. So the idea is, one of the thoughts could be, if there were no goodness, okay, when it comes to God, the idea could be, well, God can do whatever He wants, and He really could be the bully with the magnifying glass on the anthill, and we're the ants. Right? Because part of what God says to Job is, where were you? Do you know how to make this thing work? Can you explain to me again what it's like when, for this animal and that animal, or for this part of creation and that part of creation, if you really want to, if you think you are, pack a lunch, come into the ring, and we'll see who wins. All right? That's to use different language, that's... So if that's all we knew, and there was, goodness or, mercy, all these things we did to describe goodness, if that was not either one, we had evidence of that in the Bible, or if that was not part of our personal experience, how could you change the bully with the magnifying glass? Do you have the power to do that? Do you have the wisdom to do that? Do you have the ability to stand in the same court with God and demand anything? Well, the answer to that is no. So if goodness was off the table and it didn't exist, there would be really no distinction between kindness and cruelty. It just would be up to whatever God desired. No difference between heaven and hell. There would be no divine justice or divine mercy or forgiveness. There would be none of that. But because God is good, and what God has revealed is this level of goodness to God's creation, we know that there is a distinction between kindness and cruelty. There is a distinction between heaven and hell, and that there would be no divine justice that would ignore what is good at the same time.
And all the other religions of the time, that's what the God
Yeah,
was.
sure. If you go back, so her comment, Becky's comment, her comment is that compared to other religions, that's what it was like for them. And maybe the best, maybe the most known for us would be Greek mythology. So the Greek understanding of deity in the world. Deities in the Greek world are indifferent towards humanity. They don't start with goodness towards humanity. And so humanity are just puppets on the board to be used for their own pleasure or their own disposal. Now, what makes Judeo-Christian understanding of God different is that their perception of God is not indifference, but goodness. But I mean, if you compare world religions, I mean, it's right off the bat, you'll see a difference. It's not like you have to read far into the descriptions before you realize, yeah, we're starting at a different point here. And so where we start is something like this. I shall not want. Compared to, you've got to do all this work to maybe get them on your side. And if they're even on your side, who knows if that's even going to be benevolent for you or not. So, I mean, so goodness, I mean, that's an attribute that, one that we definitely want to hold on to because it undergirds so much of the other activity and work of God because it's where God starts, not where He ends. It's where He starts. And so it affects things like judgment. It'll affect things like mercy. It will affect things like forgiveness. So all these other things that we experience when we talk about God, the nature behind that is God's goodness. So this is where God begins, not where God ends. Now He ends, it's still good where He ends, but He doesn't kind of meander His way and all of a sudden it just works out well for humanity. No, He starts with goodness as the intention, the nature, and then that plays out and affects His actions. So Luke 2, Jesus is born. Angels come to the shepherds who are out in the fields. What is the message they receive? Not just go into the town, look for the baby wrapped in a manger in bands of cloth. But what do they sing? Glory to God. And then what's next? Goodwill towards people. So, from the very beginning. So this is not something that is midway through we stumble upon it. Even when we would say the apex of God's revelation, which is the incarnation, you still see behind it goodness. And it is a message that is proclaimed from start to finish, Old Testament and New Testament, and we're receivers of it. And before we're going to break in a second, but I want to touch on this part. Like the other attributes, okay, we've looked at some other attributes in previous meetings. God's goodness, it's self-caused, and we talked about this a little bit. Infinite, it's perfect, and it's eternal. God generates it, all right? Again, the psalmist in Psalm 23, or Psalm 21, the passage that you've got, we like that passage too. The reoccurring phrase in Psalm 121 is that God does not stop nor sleep, which means you're not going to catch Him off guard. You're not going to catch Him when He's not paying attention. It's not all of a sudden He's going to use up all of His goodness by 3 o'clock, and from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock you're on to on. There's none of that. I mean, the psalmist is beating the drum. God is good, describes that. Oh yeah, by the way, it doesn't end. It's self-generated, it's self-caused, it's infinite, it's perfect, and it is eternal, which means it does not end. And I mean, I've just given you 2 examples. You probably could, at the break, could come up with a handful of others that would be in line with this whole idea of God's goodness, from Psalm 23 and what that looks like, to the idea that it never ends, Psalm 121. But I mean, it's all over the place from start to finish, because it originates in His nature. It's not something that He stumbles onto. So let's take a break, and what we're going to do is we're going to come back, and so then after we break for 7-10 minutes or so, and then when we come back, what I want us to tackle is because that's who God is, everything that we've talked about. Why do we struggle with that? I mean, why isn't then every day the best day in the world, where we win the lottery over and over and over? Not the literal lottery, but that's how we feel. The idea that, you know what, it's the sun never stops shining. All right, so that's going to be your reflection homework during the break. And then you're going to come back and tell me what the answer is. All right. All right, let's go ahead and come together.
They're not coming.
I know it. I tell you. Yeah. So or if we allow it in, I mean, we can make this live. So it doesn't matter. We can look at allow it. If let's make it first person. If all right, we'll do that. Make it first person. All right. So we've been looking before the break, obviously at God's goodness. So we talked about what divine goodness is. At the same time, how that plays out and affects other aspects of what we perceive from God, other revelation. And we've also acknowledged that it's like other attributes, it's self-generating, it's self-causing, it doesn't end, it's eternal. And it's not contingent. Tozer, I want to say this. I forgot to say this before the break, but I thought this was a great line. Tozer said that God has never been kinder than He is now, nor will He ever be less kind. Yeah, which is I think that's just a great summation. The way the Bible describes that is that the sun shines on everyone, the just and the unjust, and the rain comes on everyone, the just and the unjust. We perceive rain as being negative in that context, right? But actually rain is a blessing. And so the idea of sun shining and the idea of rain, the idea of rain pouring down, both of them are seen as acts of goodness by God. And that it comes on both the just and the unjust gives insight in that it's not that God is only good to people who are good. God is good because that's His nature, which I thought that was a pretty good summation by Tozer in the chapter of just talking about this idea of God's goodness being self-caused, infinite, perfect, and eternal. Never been kinder than He is now, nor will He ever be less kind. And it's not contingent. It is something that God does because that is who God is. So, looked at goodness, God's goodness. Because of all these things that we talked about before the break and here a couple of minutes ago. So what happens when we really do hold on to this or allow it into our lives to use the question I asked before the break, why is not every day the best day ever? If that is the backdrop of who God is and what God does. Right. Okay, so the statement is because other people are not good and we're relational beings, which means that's part of our life. And so we live in this sort of area where we've got this overwhelming goodness that comes from God, and yet it gets altered, filtered through other people's actions. Right, okay. Like, give me an example. Oops. Okay, so the question is, how do you appreciate the mountaintop if you're never in the valley? Obviously, perception of life experience is helpful. But there's part of that thought that says how do you really know goodness without doing some evil? All right, we are experiencing it or whatever. I mean, it's the same concept. The idea of I need a contrasting experience or a contrasting, event or whatever to give me the right perception of what maybe something that's right before me that I've just taken for granted. Is that fair? Okay, so yeah. Right. Right. Sure. Yeah. Hey, you're preaching to the choir, sister. So I mean, I always look forward to bed. Let me tell you, you don't have to just say one time. Yeah, I'm gone. I'll see y'all later. So I mean,
That's like you go outside and your car won't start.
Sure.
Somebody hit your car.
Right.
Circumstances beyond our control.
All right. Yeah. So circumstances beyond our control. You're all touching on exactly what Tozer is getting at the end of his chapter. And this is why we need goodness and why we need to hold on to goodness and be reminded of God's goodness and that it is self-caused, infinite, perfect, and eternal, is because when we see it and hold it, or to use my language, to allow it into our lives, I think there's two things that happen. Now here you're going to get a lot of Shane in this, not so much Tozer, but he's talking a little bit about it. The first one is it humbles you. I mean, the idea that we're like the psalmist here, that it's been a windfall for us, whether we've acknowledged it or not, it doesn't change the fact that God has been good. Now, it does help to acknowledge that, right? I mean, it does help to see it, reflect of it, and to sort of allow to know that you're on the mountaintop while you're on the mountaintop. So there is this understanding of humility that I'm convinced that gratitude is a response, or humility is a response. Both of them are sort of sisters. They are responses to what you've received from God, which is goodness. And and part of it is there are things that we can control with this, because there are times where the fact that it's not the greatest day ever is because of our own hand. Okay? Okay, go ahead.
I've learned, and all of y'all know that I work at the state house.
Mm-hmm.
My little job that started one day.
Yeah, be careful for signing up, right? Yeah, so.
But I get so much out of it.
Right.
Like when I leave, and I walk in my car or something, and I sit in my car and I just think, I mean, how blessed are we?
Right.
To live where we live, to have a home.
Sure.
To have a kitchen that we can cook and have our meals. It's just, it
Right.
makes me so much more thankful.
So, right. So that to use those language, that testimony is being on the mountaintop and knowing you're on the mountaintop, and so you don't need the valley per se. Now, perception does help, okay, and there is something to you go through a life experience and it jars you back to something, or it reminds you, or it realigns your priorities, because for most people the great levels of growth or maturation, whatever word you want to use, especially spiritually or faith-wise, those great levels often come not when it's easy. I mean, so there is a level of it's kind of like your muscles. To grow your muscles, to strengthen them, you actually tear them down first, and then you build them back up, right? I mean, that's what my trainer tells me, which is why I don't go to see him. Yeah, exactly right. Why'd you go there, Shane? Yeah. So I mean, is it time? We're finished. So, but you break something down and then you build it back up. But what you build up is stronger, right? So it needs that healthy tension. It needs that level of resistance. It needs that level of struggle. Some of you have had rotator cuff surgery. I had rotator cuff surgery. I don't recommend it, and because it's real painful. The surgery's okay. The rehab, oh my God, it's terrible. It's all the way around. So for me, I had a 98% tear in my right shoulder, and I mean, it took him forever just to find the strands to put back together. So going into the surgery, he said, Shane, you're going to have 3 months of rehab. All right, it's not going to be a problem. First month's going to be difficult, but you'll get the hang of it. You're a strong guy. Everything's going to be good. Turned out being about 8 months rehab, because when he got in there, it was worse than what he thought. So they do the surgery. You come out of the surgery and you're one of these little things like this. And with the exception of them taking maybe the morphine pump out or whatever it is of pain medication that you have and putting you back in the same thing, you don't move your arm or your shoulder for about a month. They kind of play with you and say you can move your wrist, but you're really not moving anything. And so I remember asking the doctor, I was like, I need to get on with this stuff. I got stuff to do that's sooner than 7 months, right? And he said, no. He said, it's really important for you not to do anything really with your shoulder for the first month. And I said, all right, tell me why. He said, because I want all this to scar up. And I want it to get just almost impossible for you to move. Now, the reason why the rehab is so painful is because you're then going to force your way through all that tension, which will make your shoulder strong again. It's no different when it comes to our faith. So there are aspects of our faith that grows when there is a healthy tension. That's unfortunate because it's painful, right? I mean, it's because some of it comes with perspective, some of it comes with life experience, some of it comes with journeying through something and then looking back and seeing God's goodness that for whatever reason it was difficult for you to see on the front end. It would be great if it'd be great to not have to have a surgery at all, right? I mean, that'd be fantastic, just to be healthy and whole and never have to worry. But as creatures, human beings, most of us, that's a difficult, we just don't operate that way. Again, it doesn't have to be, but that's just the common. That when it's easy, a lot of times we just take it for granted. We're not humble. We don't have gratitude, thanksgiving, things like. I mean, we are to some degree, but to some degree we're really not. It's not until either we see it in the life of another person, or we as a people or as a person go through an experience that brings us back to. Sometimes that is at our own hand. Okay? Sometimes Anne's her testimony. Not that anything negative has happened, but I see somebody else and I'm learning. Fair? Okay. So that's a positive way. Sometimes at our own hand, it's a negative way. We make poor decisions. All right. Now we can unpack that. There could be some outside situations that make it easy to make that poor decision. But the nuts and bolts of it is, we make a decision that we get into a place where either we don't want to see, or we create a scenario that is very difficult to see all of God's goodness. Now, the chief of that would be sin. All right, so if you could boil it down to what the Bible would call sin. Obviously, that does make it difficult to see God's goodness, and sometimes that's at our own hand. Sometimes we live in a world that is influenced by this, and so it's not that we have done something or where it's something that we've commissioned or done. But it's just that we live in a world where those things happen. And I think some people said other people or situations, whatever that happen. But that skews our vision when it comes to God's goodness. All right? But that's where we live. So it's not always something that we do that's negative. Sometimes it's positive. Obviously, sometimes negative. Sometimes we're just the receiver. Because there could be another psalm that we look at in David's life where he talks about how he's been mistreated by other people. And yet, in spite of that, he still sees God's goodness, right? Go back and look at the times where David and Saul are not playing well with each other. What happened? I mean, David's gracious, David's, all this thing, Saul's not, and David gets the short end of the stick. And yet, when he writes about that, he writes about what he's received, and at the same time he's writing about God's goodness at the same time. So there are times where it could be either one of these three. Saying all that, we still want to hold on to God's goodness, because whether it be seeing it in the life of another person, whether it be something that we've done, some level of commission, or whether it be just because we live in a world where bad things happen or indifferent things happen, where it's not always sunny every single day, we still count on God's goodness to bring us above all these things. You with me? All right? Shane 1, Roaches 0. That's exactly right. You heard it, didn't you? I did too. I felt it. So. Sure. We experience that every Sunday morning. I just want you to know. Her comment was some things that are good for some people might not be good for another person. And the example was heat. And some people like it, some people don't. So we're not familiar with that here at the church. But you are correct, all right? I mean, the same thing like with the rain and the sun that we talked about from the Bible. Rain comes, and that's seen as a blessing overall. But if you're Noah, rain wasn't all that great at a certain time. But what we love and appreciate and what we need when it comes to God's goodness is that God's goodness brings us out of, whether it be a restored relationship, whether it be greater insight or perception, part of God's nature that is revealed to us is the backdrop by which helps us learn, restores us or forgives us, or gives us insight or change of heart or mind, or maybe patience to deal with. So all these things, regardless of whatever takes us out of, we still need God's goodness to bring us back in. And so we count on that. And we need that. And so it's worth reminding either yourself or the people around you again about what is it about God's nature that is divine goodness. And that is that part of God's nature that disposes God to be kind, to be benevolent, to have goodwill towards people, to bestow blessings upon. And it is self-caused, it is infinite, it is perfect, and it is eternal. And we are receivers of it. So don't forget it.
I was really thinking, it's a theme of the whole Bible, from the Old Testament all through the New Testament.
Right.
That every time there's judgment or something bad happens, it's always finished up with,
That's right.
with the promise of God's goodness.
Yeah, so the comment that was made was that this is a theme that shows up all throughout the Bible, and she's correct. There are, not every attribute shows up in both Old Testament and New Testament as in dominant, which means it might be more dominant in New Testament or more dominant in Old Testament. But goodness is one. Goodness shows up on both sides of the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. And so because it's the backdrop of other attributes like judgment or justice and what have you, she didn't mention the prophets by name, but she was alluding to the prophets where even where there is an action that brings learning, okay, or is the result of someone's other action, it always ends with God bringing back at His own expense, right? And that's what you find in the prophets. You see it all the time where Isaiah's a perfect example. Malachi's another one. Guys, it's been terrible because A, B, C, and D, warned you not to do it repeatedly for ages. You still do it. Told you what was going to happen. That is happening at this very moment. And you need to know that that's not going to be the final page. And so what keeps the goodness of God is that there's another page other than destruction. Because all of us, the Romans passage is, if there's one thing that's true in the Bible, which I think there's a ton of things that are true in the Bible, but if you're skeptical, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, let me tell you, that is the common denominator amongst people all throughout the world. It is equal opportunity. And the fact that, the world is not just a parking lot at the hand of God is nothing more than just goodness. And yet it's not just it's not just forgiveness, but it's forgiveness and blessing. It's forgiveness and just bestowing of good nature. There really is none that are righteous, no, not one. And yet God still interacts, loves, and cares, and doesn't quit. That's the real beauty of it. Doesn't quit. And when you compare, one of the reasons why we forget about God's goodness is because we season God's goodness or see it through the lens of what we think good is. Right? Anthropomorphic, where we want to read up to God because we're this way, we expect God to be that way. And and it's typical. It's just a natural human action. But thanks be to God, it's not that way. Because where God's goodness is self-caused, ours is not. It's very contingent, and normally it's something in reciprocation. God's goodness being infinite, ours definitely is finite. God's goodness being perfect, don't even get started, right? God's goodness being eternal, ours is incredibly limited. But so we have a tendency at times to interpret how we are as if to say that's how God is. And what the Bible screams is it is the exact opposite of that. And it is the first action, not the secondary action. And we're receivers of it. So on these days where you find yourself in one of these, and they play out in all of our lives, I hope that you will stop for a moment and hear the voice again from God that reminds you of God's goodness. It is never failing. And it is not something that he stumbles upon. It is who he is, and because he is that way, it then determines how he acts. And we're receivers of it. All right? I've been just feasting on never been kinder than he is now, nor will he ever be less kind. And that is a beautiful statement. All right, so that is chapter 16. Comments, worries, concerns?
I like the last paragraph on 84. Your book was
Well, I'm using Susan's books today because I don't have my book. So
It just said the greatness of God arouses fear within us, and his goodness encourages us to not be afraid of him.
Right.
To fear and not be afraid, that is the paradox of faith.
That's right. I think that comes right after the part where he talks about the idea of if I come to God, because sin has broken a relationship, if I come back to God because of my past, how do I know God will be good to me? Well, if you think about, I think we mentioned this last week. If you only look at one particular attribute in isolation as if that's the whole of God, then like if you focus in on the greatness or the holiness or the righteousness of God, it will produce fear. Not the good fear of reverence of the Lord. Now, it might produce that, but what it will also produce is cowering and shunning and running and hiding. Genesis 3 is a perfect example of that. God just walking in the garden and everybody runs for cover. And but if you see it in context with a whole different story. Don't underplay God's goodness. And and it's something for us to. His mercies are new every morning. All right, it's a beautiful line. And so hold on to that, count on that, trust that in your own life, trust that in the lives of your loved ones, and ultimately trust that in the world. I mean, God, it is, if He is never more kind than He is at this moment, nor will He ever be less kind, then surely you can count on that for tomorrow, for you, for others, and for the world in general. He has not stopped caring about that. All right? Any last comments? All right, again, remember, not meeting next week, spring break, so enjoy your time at the beach, and or the mountains, wherever you're going, and or here in Columbus, and but then we'll pick back up. Probably we'll start looking at a couple of, I'm going to try something over the next couple of weeks after that, is maybe looking at a couple of chapters together just to see if they're for some compare and contrast, if that helps in our discussion. All right? Go in peace.